So hello and welcome to another one of our Cromwellian conversations. My name's Stuart, I'm the curator of the Cromwell Museum in Huntingdon, and it's my great pleasure to be here with you again this morning, recording another one of our videos about different aspects of the life and times of Oliver Cromwell. And it's my great pleasure to be joined this morning by one of our academic advisors for the museum. This is Dr. Rebecca Warren from the University of Kent, whose expertise particularly is in sort of the religion and faith in the period of Cromwell, the mid-17th century, and some of the religious changes that took place in this period. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, Rebecca, and taking a bit of time out to talk to us. Very much appreciated. So we talk around the knotty issue of religion in this period, which is, I think, isn't it? It's very difficult for us, perhaps in the 21st century, particularly in the UK and in sort of Western society, to kind of wrap our heads around how important and central religion was to people's lives in the 17th century, particularly when we're a very secular society today.
Yes, I think that's right. We need to, if you like, reset our minds to try to imagine a world in which religious belief saturates almost every aspect of people's lives. Now, I think it's very important to bear in mind that not everybody is going to believe the same thing. There will always be people who are somewhere on the spectrum between total disbelief and rabid belief in a particular field, a particular area. But for most people, they will be born and live and die within the Protestant Church, and the teachings of the Protestant Church will influence how they see events that happen throughout their lives and how they behave. So we cannot automatically assume that the way we have seen things that happen, or the way we regard events, is quite the same as how they will regard it, because of this religious overtone.
It's also, I mean, it permeates things that perhaps we don't necessarily associate with, again, tend to be very secular today. So particular things like politics. So, you know, do you think that religion and politics in the sort of the 1640s and 1650s can really be separated, or are they so intertwined that they're kind of almost very difficult to remove from each other?
It is undoubtedly a period when politics and religion are very intertwined. Yes, I mean, that's absolutely true. I think one needs to be careful before saying, no, they're so completely intertwined that it's always, they're always a mixture of the two. I mean, there are clearly political moves which are undertaken, which are not really to do with religion. And I think one shouldn't necessarily assume that everybody who is active and seeking change in the revolutionary period in the 1640s and 1650s is primarily motivated by a religious impulse. But nevertheless, I mean, Cromwell says that the Civil War, I'm paraphrasing, but the Civil War wasn't fought for religion at the beginning, but God brought it to that at the end. And I think we need to understand just how much the desire for religious reform is driving some of the political moves that take place in the 1640s, and then goes on to influence the shape of the political settlement that will be produced in the early 1650s and the later 1650s under the Protectorate.
So under the sort of prior to the Civil War, or on the eve of the Civil War, really the contention, isn't it, is between, for the majority of people, obviously there's a Catholic minority in sort of, certainly in England, but the majority of people obviously within the sort of the broad Church of England, the Anglican tradition, and it's sort of almost wrestling for control of the Anglican Church, or at least the direction of the Anglican Church. Can you just talk us through, perhaps for those people who aren't necessarily familiar with it, sort of what those tensions or groups are within the Church at the time, who were sort of wrestling for the driving seat, as it were?
Yes, so you're right, it is actually a very complex period, and in order to understand the Civil War period, you must understand what's happening in religious terms in the early 17th century. So essentially, England is a Calvinist Protestant nation by the beginning of the 17th century. And this means that it's rejected Catholicism and its ideas such as transubstantiation and saints worship and so on with the Reformation in the previous century. But it's not as reformed as some people would like. So it's been reformed, but it hasn't been reformed as far as, say, some of the continental churches, which now follow Luther. So it's a bit of a middle way, one might say. But in terms of how people experience this Calvinist Protestantism, well, fundamental to it, and one of the reasons why it will always influence how people view the world, is the idea that you are either saved or you're not saved. And that God has predestined this right from the word go, and there's really nothing that you can do about it. So people have to live, those people who believe in this have to live with this idea that they've either already been saved or not. But in more practical terms, when you go to church, which you will have to do every Sunday, because that is was part of the Act of Uniformity under Elizabeth. So you must go to church every Sunday, and indeed you must keep the Sabbath, the Sunday, holy as well. When you go to church, you will follow the liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer, the Protestant prayer book. You will sign up to the idea of rejecting idolatry. In other words, the use of images, particularly in worship and in churches, is anathema to people. And as we know, many of the churches are gutted of any form of religious imagery. But particularly important, which is the sort of overarching characteristic, is the idea that the Bible is the word of God, and that in order to find guidance for your life, you must refer to the Bible. And one of the best ways of doing this is through the teachings of your preacher, your parish minister. And that's a really fundamental concept in understanding Reformed Protestantism in this period. Now, that's fine. But the problem is, as I said, there's a considerable proportion of people by the early 17th century who are looking to push the reforms away from Catholicism even further. And these are the people that we know as the Puritans, or the term that we tend to use is the godly. So the godly want to reform the church even further from any trace of popery from Catholicism. And that means, for example, that even things like the Book of Common Prayer, the Protestant prayer book, is still seen as a form of idolatry. And worse still is the existence of the bishops and the bishops' hierarchy, all of their offices and their administration. And the problem here is that they are seen to be standing between God and the individual. They're a layer of bureaucracy, if you like, that the godly believe is both unnecessary and damaging to your relationship with God. So on the one hand, in the earlier 17th century, we have the godly pushing for greater reform. But we also see the emergence of a second movement, which is what is being termed the anti-Calvinists. And they're rather reacting against the austerity of Calvinism. And they're saying, well, actually, no, we don't necessarily believe that God has ordained that you will either be saved or not from the word go. We think that actually a degree of free will is involved here. And they also believe that things like the Puritan hatred of statues and religious imagery, for example, is taking the idea of idolatry far too far. And they're looking to rebuild a church which has greater liturgy, greater ceremony in it. So by the time we reach the 1630s, we can see a real, if you like, split in the church. There is the godly move on one hand, which is seeking further reform. There's a great mass of people in the middle, of course, who just turn up to church on a Sunday and aren't too bothered so long as nobody wants them to do anything too radical.
Yeah, which is probably the same for virtually everything in history, isn't it? You know, I'll do whatever I'm told, whatever's the path of least resistance. Yeah.
Just tell me what to do, don't hassle me, and leave me to get on with actually earning a living and what have you. So we must remember there's this big section of people in the middle. But then on the other end of the scale, there are the anti-Calvinists. And under Charles I, these become known as Laudians, because he and his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, promote this anti-Calvinist agenda and try to, if you like, turn back aspects of the Calvinist church in the parishes themselves and to bring back this more ceremonial liturgical church.
It's like the Arminian tradition, isn't it? So
that's right. It's a form of Arminianism. And I think it might help also to understand, although many historians will go, when I say this, but I think for the non-historian, it perhaps helps to understand that, very broadly speaking, the godly will go on to support Parliament, and the anti-Calvinists, the Laudians, will go on to support the Royalists. Now, that's by no means always true. But in terms of understanding how religion and politics work together, that's a helpful understanding of where these two factions will come from.
Yeah, I mean, there are exceptions to that, aren't there? Like people like Edmund Verney, for example, I think he's one of those, yeah. So, but as you say, it's broadly that sort of case. We also tend to have this very particular view, certainly in terms of our popular culture idea of the Puritan, that, you know, Puritans, the godly, are a kind of homogenous group, that they're all sort of, you know, it's almost like a giant club where the uniform is the man in black with the broad-brimmed hat and, you know, looks like he's turned off a box of cereal. That again, you know, they're much more of a broader range of opinion, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And I think, again, we should be very cautious before saying, oh, yes, godly, this looks like, and this does. Yeah. Having said that, I think it is important that we remember, however, that the godly themselves do consider themselves to be a society within the larger society. They do regard themselves as different. Yeah. And obviously, there will be people on the edge of godly belief who are sort of, you know, the middle spectrum, but kind of, you know, influenced at times. And we have to remember how much people's religious views will change over time. A man who is X in the 1630s might be Y in the 1640s, and by the 1650s, he's moved on again. So we should always be really careful before ascribing a kind of a religious box to somebody and saying, this person is this and always has been and remains so.
Yeah, but particularly in a period of such great change into the bargain, you know, people's ideas going to absolutely evolve as a result of that, aren't they?
And one of the fascinating things, one of the things which makes this period such an interesting period, is the fact that it's only in the 1640s that people suddenly are given access to a range of different religious ideas. The average man in a village or woman in a provincial town in the 1620s doesn't really have access to any other views. In the 1640s, this kind of censorship, both on print but also on religious experimentation, goes out of the window, and suddenly people all over the country are much more exposed to different religious ideas and how you might worship, and indeed how you might be governed differently. So that makes a huge difference to what people will then go on to believe.
So thinking about that then, I mean, obviously we have then, you know, the king pushing certain, his particular view of religion, and obviously getting pushed back from you know, broadly from a certain sector of Parliament, certainly. Then, of course, it all blows up with the Civil War, and then, you know, you have, as is commonly used, that the world's turned upside down, you know, conflict and so on, which, you know, the traditional sort of structures do sort of break down to some point or another. How does that period of the Civil War itself, what is the impact of that in terms of people's religious beliefs? What you know, is this starting to let the genie out of the bottle, as it were?
Yeah, for sure. Once the godly take control of Parliament in the first few years of the 1640s, then suddenly they can do the thing that they've been longing to do when they've been out of power, if you like, in the 1630s. And one of those things, the key thing that they are first of all aiming for, is to dismantle the Episcopalian Church. In other words, the Church of James and Charles, which has been managed and administered by the bishops and all of their hierarchy. Well, that's going. So during the 1640s, they get rid of the bishops, they get rid of all the bishops' hierarchical offices, and his administration, the deans and chapters and so on. And really, the only remaining feature, if you like, from the 1630s into by the late 1640s is the existence of the parish and the parish minister as the unit of administration. Virtually everything else has gone, and that includes the prayer book. So the prayer book goes in the mid-1640s, and they try to replace it with an alternative which is far less prescriptive, just a kind of, you know, simple user guide. It's not the kind of the big book that you get with a piece of equipment. It's the sort of 2-page, you know, quick start guide. And so the church, by the end of the 1640s, the national church looks very different in some respects.
Mm.
So
That's the directory for worship, isn't it? The sort of what they're given.
Public worship, yes. And instead, what happens? So we have two things that then take place at the same time as this dismantling, which takes some years, of course. You can't do it literally overnight. So on the one hand, as you rightly say, there is suddenly, because press censorship collapses, suddenly the very underground Protestant sects, or particularly those people who have been worshipping very much as underground congregations in secret during the 1630s, because they can't do it publicly, suddenly can emerge into the light, if you like. And this increases the influence of different ideas as to how you might worship as a Protestant still, but outside the state church. So we have that on the one hand, and we see the emergence of various more or less radical sects. Mm. But from the state's point of view, what they are trying to do is to replace Episcopalianism with a Presbyterian church. Now, there's a great example, because the Scots have had a Presbyterian church north of the border since the later part of the 16th century. And so the majority in Parliament would like to have a similar sort of thing in this country. But the problem is that by 1648-49, particularly with the purge of the Presbyterians in Parliament, a lot of the Presbyterians, this idea of the Pride's Purge, that's right, this idea of establishing a Presbyterian national church instead of the Church of Charles I really falls apart, and it isn't ever established across the country. And what we end up with is a bit of a dog's breakfast, to be honest, during the years of the Republic from 1649 to 1653, where we have the continuation of many parish churches with their ministers, not all of them, some of them have been thrown out, but some of them have remained, and they are doing heaven knows what kind of service. We don't really know. Some of them are continuing to be kind of closet Anglicans, closet Episcopalians, but most of them, or many of them, will have a Presbyterian minister, and it'll be a sort of form of kind of godly, maybe Presbyterian, maybe strictly Presbyterian. We don't know for sure what's going on in many of the parish churches. It's a real muddle. But one of the things we do know is that there is a significant number of people who are what we could term independents. Now, independence is a highly contested term. Some people use the phrase Congregationalists. It's used both in contemporary literature and later literature in all sorts of different ways. So it's quite a complex term to understand. But essentially, it is the idea that you should be able to worship as a congregation with other people who share your location, your commitment, your beliefs, and in particular, if you like, covenanted as a group. You should be able to worship in these groups outside the parish church if you wish to. So it's not dependent on the parish, they are dependent on a covenanted agreement between people. Some independents believe that this sort of worship should nevertheless be overseen by the state. But a considerable number of people, more radical independents or Congregationalists, believe that there should be a total separation between church and state. The state should have nothing to do with how people worship. So by the 1650s, and certainly with the arrival of the Protectorate in very early 1654, we have a whole range of different practices carrying on. And I think we'll talk about the Protectorate Church itself in a moment.
Mm. Yes, I mean, just going back to sort of this sort of explosion of weird and wonderful sects. I mean, there is, a whole set of them that appeared only in the 1640s and 1650s. Some of them very much pertained around sort of religious ideas. Some of them almost very political in their own ways. So you think particularly of people like the Fifth Monarchists, for example. You talk us through sort of some of the most significant of these weird and wonderful set of groups that sort of pop up at this time.
Yes, the radical sects. They again, it's always a spectrum with religious belief, isn't it? So one might say that on the conservative end of the radical sects, you have the proto-Baptists, if you like, the people who will go on to become various forms of the Baptist Church. Now, when these start to emerge in the 1640s, in particular during the Civil War and in the ranks of the army, some people will regard this very much as a sect. Now, the Baptists become subsumed. They become within the limits of acceptability of the state church, certainly under Cromwell. But at the outset, they are regarded with considerable concern by many people, particularly because they believe that you shouldn't be baptized as a child. You have no free will to choose or to not choose. And therefore, it's only when you attain your majority that you should be able to make that conscious decision to be baptized and to enter the church. Now, that's a real problem for a lot of people. So in that sense, they are also regarded as a sect. That's very much, though, at the conservative end. If we sort of go through the range of sects,
whole spectrum. There's these lovely illustrations, aren't there? They're kind of, you get woodcuts illustrations of sort of, you know, I mean, the Adamites wandering out with no clothes on and all of this sort of thing. You know, yeah.
Yes, there's some pretty erotic imagery out there, which is expressing people's concern as to what these people might be up to. I mean, there are no holds barred images sometimes. There is as you rightly mentioned, one of the most important sects is a group called the Fifth Monarchists. Now, the Fifth Monarchists draw their title from the idea that it was prophesied in the books of Daniel and Revelation that there would be 4 great dynasties on earth, the last of which was the Roman, which of course is now seen to be coming to an end. And then the 5th one would be Christ, and God would be Christ would establish his dominion over earth. And the Fifth Monarchists believe that they are on the verge of this happening. The Roman dynasty is now clearly over, and that this great 1,000-year rule of Christ is about to start. And you sometimes hear them called the millenarians, or millenarianism, and this is based on this idea of this 1,000-year rule of Christ. The reason the Fifth Monarchists are important is really because of their political importance. So there are some very senior political figures like Thomas Harrison.
Let's say Harrison is sort of the most significant, isn't he? Yeah.
In the ranks of the movers and shakers in the godly cause, if you like. And that gives them a level of importance, particularly, so they don't really arise until 1651. But in this early 1650s period, they are the people who are saying, look, we are on the edge of prophecies. We are going to demolish the existing political situation, both at home and possibly abroad as well, and establish Christ's dominion on earth. One of the things that's going to mean is that we must get rid of the current government. In other words, the Long Parliament, which is now the Rump Parliament in the early 1650s. And there is some sense that Cromwell may have been influenced in this very early period by them, but of course he says nothing, so we don't really know.
As usual, Cromwell maintaining his usual policy of what today we'd call plausible deniability, isn't it?
Yes. Plausible deniability is so true. With the arrival of the nominated assembly, the final throw at an attempt at Parliament in 1653, this is, if you like, the apogee of millenarian, of Fifth Monarchist achievements. They think that now this is the beginning of the rule of the saints, this is the government of the saints. And when it collapses, of course, in the late year of 1653, we really then see the collapse of the Fifth Monarchist movement as a really important player. So this is this is one of the sects which is so important because of its political importance. But right out on the far end of this spectrum, we then have a number of weird and, as you say, weird and wonderful beliefs. So there's a group called the Ranters, who have all sorts of ideas and are commonly believed to worship naked, with all sorts of extraordinary and unmentionable practices going on. And the reason that they and the better known sect, which we know, of course, as the Quakers, which also arises in the 1650s, but at the time is a far more difficult and uncontrolled sect. It's politically very divisive. But the reason that all of the sects, but particularly the more radical sects, are so important but also so dangerous in people's minds is that they threaten the stability of the nation. And one of the things we have to always understand about this, about the 17th century generally, and about this period too, is that the unity of the nation, the stability of the nation, is desperately important to people across the classes of society.
Yeah.
And the danger of these sects is that these people are out of control. They threaten the norms of behavior, and therefore they threaten the stability of society. And they are important in terms of the religious program that Cromwell puts out, because they are so unacceptable that they will put a boundary to this idea of liberty of conscience. So liberty of conscience is something the Cromwellians believe in, but once you get into the far end of the radical sects, no, that's unacceptable. And so they will themselves force a limit, if you like, to liberty of conscience.
So thinking about that, obviously now, I think if we turn to sort of Cromwell himself, I mean, how much do we know about Cromwell's sort of personal beliefs and religious practice? I mean, as always with him, as I say, the plausible deniability in terms of the political side of things, but he's very opaque in terms of a lot of the aspects of his life. I mean, what do we know about his sort of religious? We know obviously he has his religious conversions sometime, probably in the 1630s, late 1620s and early 1630s, where he becomes obviously deeply religious. But how much do we know about his sort of religious practice? What his personal views were, obviously, other than this very personal relationship with God and God's providence, which is central to his life.
Yes, so you're absolutely right that really, distressingly, we know very little about Cromwell's own belief and certainly about his practice. You're right, he undergoes some kind of Puritan conversion, probably in the early 1630s. And this means then that he is one of the godly. And of course, as you said, we know that the godly are seeking to do God's work, not just in their own souls, but also in the wider community. They are seeking to establish a new Jerusalem in England, if you like.
Yeah.
So Cromwell signed up to this, and it will affect everything that he does subsequently to that. The religious objectives that he holds will always be behind his actions after that. We term him as a religious independent, although we really know, I mean, he I think, clearly sees himself with it as an independent, but what that means to him, we honestly can't really define. We do know there are limits to his godly belief, if you like. So people who are outside what Cromwell terms to be acceptable are, of course, the Catholics, the Prelatists, in other words, the Episcopalians, the people who support the bishops, and those radical sects that we've mentioned, those people who are so radical that they fall outside his idea of what is godly. And particularly he's frightened of those because he sees himself, of course, as the leader of the nation. Certainly after 1654, he's the leader of the nation. And if he allows the nation to follow blasphemous and heretical practice, then he may bring down the wrath of God, not just on himself, but on everybody. So he takes this godly responsibility extremely seriously. But you're absolutely right. We don't know where he worshipped. We don't know how he worshipped. We don't know who he worshipped with. We don't know how, for example, he manages to settle, for example, what we believe was his daughter Mary's marriage in the middle of the 1650s, which, as we understand it, may well have taken place according to the rites of the Book of Common Prayer. Now, Cromwell, of course, has prescribed with the other godly the Book of Common Prayer. So he seems to be he has fairly flexible views. And I think the most important thing, in a sense, to understand about him, apart from the fact that we don't know much about what he did, is the fact that he is what's called an anti-formalist. In other words, his guiding principle is that many of the things other people are getting worried about, the way you do things, the kind of what you wear or what you say or how you behave, many of these are what's termed adiaphora. In other words, these things don't matter.
Yeah.
What he is seeking is the unity of the godly and that means that the different forms that godliness might take really are not particularly important to Cromwell. And in his speeches, we see him arguing for people to be less worried by, you know, what a Baptist is doing, and more moved by the fact that he is clearly part of the Baptist Church. So anti-formalism and the strive to keep the godly unified are really the guiding lights, if you like, in Cromwell's Protestantism, his Puritanism. But quite what he does when he worships, we've no idea. And we don't know who he does it with, and we don't know what he believes, because he, alas, didn't leave us any records.
No, that's the case, isn't it? What he does seem to have is this very personal relationship with God, doesn't he? So, I mean, you can see that if that's his personal belief, it's not surprising that actually he really shouldn't be fussed terribly about what other people are up to in terms of how they carry that out. You know, it's important to have that sort of. You can see him almost, I mean, particularly when he's having things like, you know, agonising over whether to accept the crown in 1657. He's having he's having a personal chat with God on a daily basis, as far as he's concerned, as he's agonising about this particularly important decision.
Yes, that's right. So throughout his career, certainly from the 1640s onwards, it's quite clear that he believes that he is doing the will of God. So he sees the great victories that he achieves in the Civil War as God's work. But when things go wrong, he is then cast into a valley of doubt, because maybe he's constantly trying to find out what God wants him to do. When he fails in doing something, so some of the less successful military endeavours, but particularly with the Western design, the attempt to take on the Spanish in the Caribbean, and that it goes horribly, horribly wrong. And suddenly he is really frightened that he has misunderstood what God wanted from him. And so he goes into these periods of despair. And throughout both the good times and the bad times, as you rightly say, Stuart, he is in this constant dialogue with God about, am I doing the right thing? What do you want me to do? I think we should remember that this is what the godly generally are doing. So he's not a sole figure. If you are a good Puritan, that's what you're doing on a daily basis. But of course, if you're head of state, it makes rather more of an impact.
Absolutely. I mean, we know that, I mean, you know, he has these sort of episodes even before his conversion, you know, his depressive episodes. And, you know, I think, you know, my personal view is this of, you know, when he one of the reasons he adopts his very devout faith is part of his, as with many people, it's a sort of coping mechanism or a way of dealing with his sort of his depressive episodes. But then you can see it becoming a vicious circle in the fact of when God isn't sort of obviously doing what he wants, then that plunges him to another depressive episode. You know, it's kind of a bit of a vicious circle in a way, really, isn't it?
Yes, it is. He uses, as you say, faith and his dialogue with God to understand his life in a way.
Yeah.
And this is very typical. So other people will be going through this same kind of situation. But of course, in Cromwell, because we think that he has some element of depression or manic depression, even, then it's kind of writ large throughout his life.
Yeah.
So but I think we need to bear in mind that for Cromwell, the driving force constantly is doing God's work on earth. And that's what's motivating him. And everything else really is kind of, as he says, adiaphora.
So what's sort of, you know, bearing all of that in mind in terms of his personal views and obviously the sort of the background that we talked about, what does the sort of the settlement under Cromwell, once we get to the Protectorate, what does that look like? You know, again, the popular view is that it's sort of, you know, the word dictatorship is bandied around, I think, and as we've talked about in previous videos, sort of probably incorrectly for the 17th century, that people feel that it's sort of moral clampdown under Cromwell, or at least that's the popular perception, and therefore the assumption that it's, you know, the Puritan killjoys in charge, and that's sort of, you know, it's almost a religious state. Is that necessarily the case? So I suspect I know the answer to this one. Or you know, actually, are we talking about something that is much wider in terms of its religious toleration?
Gosh, that's a very big question.
It is, isn't it? Because he talks about moral reform and reforming the nation, but then also separate to that, there is this whole business around sort of, religious toleration as well.
Yes, and there are several strands to this as a question, really. So we have the idea of what is the state church under Cromwell? What is religion under Cromwell? We then also have, as you rightly say, the drive for moral reform. Now, of course, that draws on the drive for a godly nation, but it's very much a behavioural thing. So this is all about trying to stop people from gambling too much, from drinking too much, from swearing. And part of this is bound up with trying to stop people from fomenting political, dissent. But if we just go back to a minute for what the Cromwellians establish as their state church, because this is the background to everything else that happens. And their objective in their settlement, or what I prefer to term their religious program, if you like, is that they want to widen everybody's access to the gospel. That's really what they're trying to do. They're not trying to tell people exactly what to do. They want to widen, as far as they possibly can, access to the gospel. And as you rightly say, there is a desire to offer liberty of conscience. In other words, give people the freedom to worship in the form that they wish to do, within the limitations that we've already talked about. So some things are out, but within that, Cromwell particularly is constantly fighting to maintain liberty for those people who don't wish to worship within the church itself. And this comes, of course, partly from his years in the army, where this idea of worship, but outside the parochial structure, was so important. So that's really important. And all the Cromwellians do in terms of saying, this is what we think the church is about, when they first take over in the instrument of government, the written constitution, is they say that the faith of the nation will be the Christian religion as contained in the scriptures, which is pretty broad.
That's about as vague as you can get, really, isn't it?
About as vague as you can get. Now, the thinking is that they will go on to produce a better statement, but in fact they never do, because they never manage to keep Parliament going long enough to acknowledge a written statement. So this really remains, if you like, certainly until 1657, the objective of what the church under the Cromwellians should be. What that means in the parishes is that they continue. So we have to remember there's a large conservative majority really in Parliament and the nation who really don't want too much change. And so the Cromwellians say, well, we're going to keep the state church, if you like, we're going to keep the national church. In other words, churches are going to carry on. So the independents don't think you need a church, but they're jolly useful places, and they've got them, and they've also got a whole lot of parish ministers who might as well carry on being, godly, teaching the right thing in church. Yeah. So they're going to maintain the existing parochial structure throughout the country. And more contentiously, they're going to continue to, I was going to say pay the minister, but people are going to have to continue to pay tithes in order to maintain their minister in the church. And this is really problematic for a lot of the more radical end of the godly. But nevertheless, until they say we can come up with a better idea, we're going to carry on with tithes. But they are going to allow liberty of conscience. So the requirement under the Act of Uniformity that you should go to church on a Sunday was repealed in 1650. So you're no longer going to be punished if you don't go to church, but you must go to some form of worship, tolerated worship. But you are going to therefore be allowed to meet as a gathered church, a separated church, if you wish to do so. And the way they are going to police this church, if you like, the way they're going to manage it, because of course all the management of the church has now gone, all the administration has now been chucked out of the window in the 1640s, which is why things are a bit desperate by the early 1650s. And so they put together three bodies who are going to manage the church, if you like. So first of all, there is a body called the Triers, and this is a group of men in London who are going to either approve or reject any man who wants to become a minister. So the state is going to oversee who can become a minister and who can't within the church. Those people who are preaching to separated congregations do not fall into this category. But if you're going to take tithe maintenance, you're going to have to be approved by the state.
Yeah.
The second thing they do is they have bodies of men in the counties called the ejectors, who are going to be responsible for throwing out ministers who don't do what the state thinks a minister should do. So either they're teaching the wrong thing, or they're drunk every Sunday, or they're touching up little girls, or whatever they're doing, which is unacceptable. The ejectors are going to be responsible for chucking them out. So in that way, they're policing the clergy, the quality of the clergy. They're trying always to maintain a high quality clergy. The third part of their regime here is that they revamp an existing body of men in London who are going to oversee the financial state of the church. And they are going to constantly be trying to assign income to parishes which are too poor to maintain a minister. And they actually have a really, really important role and a really powerful role, but because they're dull money people, no one ever thinks about them. But they are the third arm of the Cromwellian protectorate, and they're the Cromwellian programme, and they're a really important part. And the reason they're important is because without some kind of reform of the financial situation, which is pretty dire in a great many parishes will have no minister because they cannot afford to maintain one. So that's how the Cromwellians manage the state church, really. And they do bring stability, and they do bring a degree of administrative certainty to what has been a completely almost dysfunctional church in the early 1650s.
But who kind of wins and loses out of this? I mean, there's also there of course there are other faiths as well, sort of in the background. I mean, the most famously, of course, associated with Cromwell is the sort of the slightly complicated sort of terms of the readmission of the Jewish community into England at this time. But there's also, of course, there is a significant minority of the kind of Catholics in England as well. So just thinking about sort of some of these other faiths, what sort of is the impact on them of all this?
Yes, so the Catholics actually, compared to, for example, the Elizabethan regime, the Catholics actually aren't doing too badly under Cromwell. He doesn't persecute them in an outright sense. We don't see any of the kind of, the Jesuit cells and all of this kind of thing going on. The Catholics are mainly useful to Cromwell in the main way the Catholics are useful to Cromwell is that they are a bit of a milk cow in the sense that he can fine them for being Catholic, and the protectorate is constantly in need of money. So the main way that the Catholics suffer is through having to pay fines. But other than that, they are generally speaking pretty much left alone. And I think it's
Ron Hutton who said, isn't it? Actually by the back door, they actually did quite nicely out of the. They were better treated than they had been for years beforehand, in a way.
Yes, and I think in a way that may be, and I'm speculating here, because Cromwell no longer perceives them. He doesn't perceive them as a religious threat. They're no longer in a position of power. And actually, with the subjugation of Ireland and the success of the new model army and so on, that. Although the protectorate never feels it is secure, I think the Catholics in England, he does not see them as a political threat. And one cannot overestimate too highly the real problem with different forms of religion is whether they are also a political threat. So that's the real difficulty. If you're just prepared to keep your head down, worship somewhere that's a little bit, it may be a bit odd, but ultimately you're not actually going to do any damage to anybody else. You're not going to encourage anybody to rise up against the state. Then that's one set of people they can kind of just ignore a bit. And so, as you say, the Catholics are not persecuted other than they're fined. The Jews, now that's a completely different situation. And again, the Jews actually have much to thank Cromwell for. So he's contacted in 1655 by a gentleman called Manasseh ben Israel, who asks if the Jews could be let back into England. Now, bear in mind, of course, they were thrown out under Edward I in 1290. So the Jews have been away from the country for a very long time. And Cromwell is up for this. Cromwell is quite happy to see the Jews readmitted. But it's not really because he is tolerant. Cromwell's thinking, as we understand it, is that the conversion of the Jews to Christianity is one of those stages, one of those steps that must happen before Christ's kingdom can be established on earth. And so his thinking, as I understand it, is that if we let the Jews back into the country, then he doesn't have any intention to rigidly convert the Jews, but what he thinks is that they will then be exposed to the gospel. They will be exposed to Christianity, they will hear the word of the scriptures, and they will naturally convert. And so this is a necessary step.
It's conversion by osmosis, isn't it, really? It's that sort of, that's sort of what he's thinking, in a way.
And it's true that Parliament, I mean, nobody else thinks like this. I mean, Cromwell is really out on his own here. The more conservative members of Parliament are horrified by the idea. And so they do their best to stop it, but he actually manages to engineer a situation very covertly without doing anything too overtly, which allows the Jews to start to come back into England. And I think this is, one has to bear in mind as well, also, that of course, at the back of Cromwell's mind, the dire financial situation of the government is always there. And the Jews are, of course, financiers of excellence. So that may also have had a part in his thinking. But I think it's this religious idea that they may be convertible, which is so important.
So I suppose finally, really, we have to consider, obviously Cromwell dies of various illnesses and circumstances in September 1658. There's then the sort of chaotic 18 months there afterwards where things don't quite go so well. And then we get the Restoration in 1660. Now, how do we look at this? Was the sort of the Restoration, did the Restoration put the genie back in the bottle? Or had the nature of, faith and religion sort of in this country sort of changed irrevocably as a result of what had been happening in the 1640s and 1650s?
Well, that, of course, would depend on who you talk to. So,
inevitably, yes. Everybody will have an opinion on this one.
But particularly contemporaries will have an opinion. So what happens is, with the restoration of Charles II in 1660, of course, immediately the Episcopalian Church is restored with him. So the bishops, what is left of the bishops, come back. The idea of the bishops' hierarchy, their administration, that is assumed and goes on to be the re-establishment of the Church of England. So that is going to happen, and that does happen very, very quickly. Many godly ministers are thrown out of their parishes almost as soon as Charles steps foot back in England. We see a kind of removal of some of the godly ministers, and the old Anglican ministers, the old Episcopalians who've been out on their ears during the 1640s and 50s are coming back and saying, right, this is my church and I'm back. And I mean, we see episodes of real violence as well as a more gradual change. Now, under Charles is relatively tolerant, and it's hoped that a settlement can be made with the godly, with particularly the Presbyterians, and that they can re-establish a church which perhaps can even include the more, the nicer form of godly. The reality is that the bishops, when they return, are hell-bent on revenge, I think is really what one would say, and a very persecuting Episcopalian church, what becomes the Anglican church, is put in place. Charles isn't really up for this, but he doesn't have a lot of choice.
Yeah. And
so during the 1660s, what we see is a hardline bishop's bench, a hardline Episcopalian church re-established, and the godly thrown out in 1662, thrown out of their parishes, godly congregations shut down and persecuted. And there is great suffering that goes on amongst what we now we've called them the godly up till now, but we now start to think of them as the nonconformists. In other words, people who will not conform to the Episcopalian, the restored Episcopalian church. And they suffer really quite considerably. So if you asked one of the bishops, have you managed to re-establish the Church of Charles I, for example? They'd say, yes, we're working on it. We're going to go back to how it was before. You're right, of course, though, that actually the genie can't be put back into the bottle. So when they come back in 1660, 1662, what they find is a population which has had 20 years of religious experimentation and, for many people, religious freedom. And you cannot take that away from the national consciousness. You can persecute as much as you like, but religious belief is the most tenacious thing, and people will continue to believe what they believe and to want to worship in the way they want to worship. And indeed, when the bishops get a little bit worried about all this, they do a survey, they do a census, if you like, in 1669 to see just how many nonconformists are still out there after all their efforts in the 1660s. Are they all still there? And the results that come back are absolutely horrifying for the church, because they realise that in some places, East Anglia, for example, the Puritan heartlands, in some places, 1 in 3 people regard themselves still, after 10 years, after 8 years, as a nonconformist. And we can see from that no, you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. You can re-establish the Church of England with its bishops, but there will always be a considerable section of the population now who cannot conform to that church, cannot conform to the prayer book, cannot conform to the bishops, and will continue to worship outside the church under the radar. And it's not until we get to, through the brief reign of James II, it's not until we get to William and Mary, with the Act of Toleration in 1689, that we see a recognition that it has been a failure to assume that you can return to the pre-war church, and that some toleration must be given to the nonconformist and the dissenters.
Even so, though, I mean, there's things like, restrictions on voting rights, attending universities, all sorts of things, isn't there? That carries on.
Oh, indeed, yes.
I mean, so that that you're kind of treating not only nonconformists, but obviously also, again, still the Catholic community, the Jewish community as well. They're all sort of treated as second-class citizens because of their religious beliefs. But they're still there.
Yeah, they're still there, but they are, as you said, under a very great social disadvantage. It's not until the 18th, 19th centuries that we see certain religious groups being given any element of, if you like, say in the government of the country. But we can put the beginning of the, if you like, the nonconformist culture, subculture, which will become assimilated into the national church eventually, or the national mix of religions. We can firmly see that it has its roots in the 1640s and 1650s, when for a brief moment you were allowed to think differently about how you're going to worship, about what you're going to believe, and about whether the state should actually be able to tell you what you should do in church, which is what makes it such a fascinating period.
It's also, of course, it's issues that we still discuss today. Of course, this is the other thing that's so fascinating about this period. It raises questions about the nature of freedom, democracy, political and religious thought that we're still wrestling with in 2020. And this is the beginning of this sort of whole discussion and debate we're still having.
Yes, that's right, and I think that's why it's, as you say, right, it's such a fascinating period that issues which were hotly debated then, we are still hotly debating now. And one could go on at length about them, but I think we've probably
exhausted ourselves now.
Maybe we should have another conversation about that.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I think, as I say, when we're discussing with Paul Lady of the week, we need a roundtable discussion to talk about the impacts from this period, and also I think why this sort of period isn't sort of as widely known as it should be. So I think that's a future video we'll come back to. Rebecca, thank you ever so much for that. I mean, it's been a fascinating time talking through that, and thank you very much for your time and expertise for joining us today.
Well,
hope you've enjoyed that and found it interesting. If you have, please do remember to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll see at the end we have our title card, where you can also follow us on Facebook and on Twitter, where we have a lively debate about many of the issues that we've been talking about in this video and other aspects of 17th century history. Otherwise, we've got other videos coming up over the next few weeks, so do keep an eye out for those. And the Cromwell Museum is reopening on the 4th of July. Thank goodness, as the lockdown begins gradually to be eased down. So we will be doing socially distanced reopening. So if you've got the opportunity to come and see us then in person, then please do come and do so. And otherwise, we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you very much.